This episode is sponsored by BioLogos. If you're a Christian with a science-loving teenager in your life, you've probably noticed how hard it is to find resources that take the Bible and science seriously. You need to check out the new Integrate curriculum from BioLogos. Integrate was designed and vetted by scientists, Bible scholars, and educators to help high schoolers see how science and faith can work hand in hand. Now through August 31st, use the code SUMMER50 at checkout to get 50% off your order at biologos.org/integrate. That's biologos.org/integrate.
Welcome to the Holy Post. On Saturday, Donald Trump narrowly survived an assassin's bullet. Will this begin to tone down the dehumanizing and apocalyptic rhetoric in our politics, or is it only going to add fuel to conspiracy theories and to extremists? Rich Villodas is back this week to talk about his new book on the Sermon on the Mount, The Narrow Path. He says obeying the sermon is not how we achieve salvation, but it's how we demonstrate it. And the fact that so few Christians seem to take Jesus' command seriously calls their salvation into question. Also this week, Phil reports from Med City, and Kaitlyn introduces us to Persian ice cream. For our HOLYPOST Plus subscribers this week, we have a brand new SkyPod episode, as we do every Friday, but I also have a bonus interview with Rich Villodas about judgment. What did Jesus really mean when he told us not to judge others in the Sermon on the Mount, and how do we actually practice that? Rich has some fantastic pastoral wisdom on that, and given the tensions in the country right now about politics, it's an important message for all of us to hear. To become a HOLYPOST Plus subscriber, go to holypost.com to learn more. Here is episode 626.
Hey there, welcome back to HOLYPOST Podcast. I'm Phil. I'm back. I am here with Sky Jatani. Hi, Sky.
Hi, Phil. Glad to have you back.
Thank you. And Kaitlyn Shess. Hi, Kaitlyn.
Hi, Phil. Also glad to have you back.
Thank you. This is the first time I've recorded with Sky in the new office, so I'm having trouble. I all out of sorts with your background. It feels like you're dialing in from your lawyer's office.
It does look like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Were you at a closing? Did you have to go in the conference room for the closing on your house or something?
I think
that's a nice interpretation of him being in a lawyer's office.
Yeah,
That's so nice.
Thank you. Right, not like I'm being indicted or prosecuted for something. It's a good assumption.
No, because then you'd be dialing in from jail.
That is also true. Or my defense attorney's office.
Yeah. So how are you going to redecorate so it looks more exciting?
Don't know yet. We actually had a conversation today in the broader office about what we want to do with the space. But it's one of those things where you kind of want to live in a space for a while before you make any purchases or do anything drastic. Yeah. So this is just how we found it. And it used to be some kind of like financial trading company office space. So it it's a lot of wood. Kind of nicer features. It's not
finance people just love wood. Oh, that's ridiculous. We'll take care of that. We'll rip all that right out of there. We're renting it though, so we can't really rip anything out. We don't own it. And now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Kaitlyn.
Today's episode is sponsored by Sundays. This is Phil. I have a dog. You have a dog. We love our dogs, and we gotta feed them something. Fresh food with human-grade ingredients is a better way to treat our dogs than that old bag of whatever that stuff is. Sawdust and cow bones? I have no idea. But fresh pet food is expensive and inconvenient, and that's where Sundays comes in. No, not the day. The new dog food company that makes air-dried dog food from a short list of human-grade ingredients. It's healthy, with beef, chicken, and digestive aids like pumpkin and ginger. It's convenient. Unlike other fresh dog foods, it's zero prep, zero mess, and zero stress. Sundays is shelf stable and ships right to your door. And it's affordable, costing 40% less than other healthy dog food brands because they don't waste money shipping frozen packages. We've got a special offer for our dog-loving Holy Posters. Get 35% off your first order of Sundays. Go to sundaysfordogs.com/holypost or use the code HOLYPOST at checkout. That's sundaysfordogs.com/holypost. Upgrade your pup to Sundays and feel good about the food you feed your dog. And thanks to Sundays for sponsoring this episode. The Holy Post is sponsored by Blueland. Everyone has a toilet. No, this is not news of the butt. You can keep listening, Kaitlyn. Everyone has to clean their toilet. What if there was an easier way to clean your toilet that was also good for the environment? Blueland Sustainable Toilet Cleaner Tablets. Drop one in, watch it fizz, brush, and flush. And they're completely plastic-free. Did you know it's Plastic-Free July? On average, people generate 1,800 pounds of plastic waste per year. That's not good. Blueland uses no single-use plastic in any component, from bottles, tablets, and wrappers to shipping. Blueland products are effective and affordable. Their toilet tablets are proven to work on rust stains, mineral deposits, lime scale, hard water stains, and more. And get more savings by buying refills in bulk or setting up a subscription. Celebrate Plastic-Free July with up to 25% off your Blueland order. This is a special limited time offer. Go to blueland.com/holypost for up to 25% off. blueland.com/holypost for up to 25% off. So, update on my lovely wife, Lisa. She is in Rochester, Minnesota for the next 5 or 6 more weeks doing treatment for cervical cancer at Mayo Clinic. So 1 week is done. That's for Mayo. Hey, Mayo, 5 weeks to go. First week went well. Prognosis looks good. Everyone there is positive about it. Rochester, Minnesota is an interesting town. It's like a college town, except the college is a giant hospital. A giant hospital. Actually, 2 hospitals and a giant clinic. There's 2 different hospitals there that are all now Mayo. So, and then there's the clinic. And then there's the research buildings, and they keep building new ones. There's probably, walking around downtown Rochester, 10 Mayo buildings, and some of them are big, like 10 stories high. So there is a lot of, it's like a sandwich with too much mayo. There is a lot of mayo in downtown Rochester. And yes.
If it's like a college town, I'm assuming it's not full of bars. Is it like full of pharmacies or something? What?
There are a lot of restaurants, but then there are a lot of hotels for people that are in town for Mayo. Because if you're not, in one of the 2 hospitals, you're just visiting the clinic and you need to provide your own lodging. So there's just, I don't know, it's probably 20 hotels within walking distance of the Mayo Clinic. But they also run their own shuttles. So all these, you check into a hotel in Rochester, they will hand you the Mayo shuttle schedule. You just say, here's their schedule. If they just assume that that's why you're there. You
it's
don't
like
even
Disney
have to
World.
Ask. It's like Disney World for sick people. That's what my wife and I kept saying over and over again, because instead of stroller parking, they have wheelchair parking. And there can be like 20 wheelchairs all in a little corner. And you say, oh, and we walk by and say stroller parking.
Do
and
they have
yes?
Like famous medical character meet and greets?
Well, they have the statue of the Mayo brothers. There's this like the statue of Walt.
So kind of.
Yeah. So they don't. No one dresses up as the Mayo brothers, but there are statues and portraits, and then there's the Mayo Civic Center, and there's Mayo High School, and there's like everything, Mayo Park. So yeah, and then the homes of the 2 brothers up on the bluff that are very lovely. It's really interesting. So there's a lot more. Because it's in the middle of cornfields, it's 90 minutes south of Minneapolis. So you go 5 minutes in any direction and you're in corn, but it's got a really bustling downtown with lots of restaurants and stuff, that's way more bustling than it would be for a 100,000 person city in the middle of nowhere.
Yes. Do they have more than the average number of handicap parking spots?
No, they have valet parking.
Oh.
They just have valet parking.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, and then all the shuttles. And then, and you can walk. It's very walkable. Very walkable. It has a little river flowing through it called the Zumbra River, which is kind of a cute river.
Okay.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Going back up on Thursday.
It seems like they've created a good environment for healing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The nickname is Med City because it's where you go to get your meds. Hey, Got any meds? Yeah, come to Med City. We got lots of meds in Med City.
So I guess it's better than Drug City. That could be something very different.
Here's a tip. If you want to blend in Rochester and not get noticed, just wear scrubs. You can go anywhere. No one will even look at you twice. You just walk around in scrubs, because half the people in downtown are walking around in scrubs.
And is it like Star Trek where there's different color scrubs depending on which department you're in?
Of course, yeah. Yeah, it is like Star Trek. It's a lot like Star Trek.
Yeah.
And Disney World and Star Trek.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's like a utopian medical future.
It is. It is our utopia. Yeah, as long as your insurance will cover it, you can go to medical Disney World and get treated by the medical seven dwarves. And, it's very cool. And if you're a head of state, you get a fast pass. You can go right to the front of the lines.
Well, that's like, what's that club that Disney has? Club 31?
33.
33, right. Yeah,
Club 33. Mm-hmm. Have you ever been there, Sky?
No, why would I?
I've eaten there twice.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh.
How did you get access? You got to explain what that is to non-Disney files.
Club 33 is the semi-secret dinner club inside Disneyland on the second floor in the New Orleans Square, the little New Orleans
Is that above Pirates of the Caribbean?
No.
Oh.
Wait. It's maybe partially, but it has a balcony and a long balcony, so you can have dinner up there and then go out on the balcony and watch the show. That's right over the lagoon where they do that evening show. Yeah. And there's a decades-long waiting list for memberships. It's a members-only thing, and it costs a lot to be a member. And you mostly have to wait for someone to die to get a membership or have a membership passed down to you. And it's a restaurant.
Unlike HOLYPOST Plus, where no one has to die.
No one has to die to be a member. Isn't that great, everybody?
That's right.
Yeah, but the fun part is that there's no sign for it.
Right.
There's no, if you have a reservation there, you go to an unmarked door, and there's a little speaker box next to the door, and you push the button on the speaker box, and they answer. You say, "I'm here. I have a reservation, 7:30," and they buzz you in, and you go inside a little room, and then there's an old style elevator, and you get on the old style elevator, and you go up, and you're in Club 33. So a friend of mine has a membership, and he took me once, and then you can't do this anymore. But another time, I was going out to California with my daughter on a special daddy-daughter trip, and I said, "Could you get us into Club 33?" And he said, "Yeah, I'll put a reservation in your name."
Wow.
So I got to take Sydney to Club 33, just the two of us, which was very fun. They don't let you do that anymore. The member has to be present. So that doesn't work anymore.
If there are any Club 33 members listening to this who are HOLYPOST fans and would ever be interested in taking one or all of us as guests, because they have a Club 33 at Disney World also, not just Disneyland.
I think so.
I think they do.
Think they
Right.
do.
So,
yeah.
anyway.
I have a Club 33 mug on my shelf up there. And
I don't think I ever noticed that.
Pen. Yeah, I know. I'll show it to you next time you're here.
All right. I think this is a tangent. We've been on a tangent here, Phil.
Anyway, Rochester, Minnesota, the Club 33 of medical care. I highly recommend. Swing by, check it out. It's fascinating. And now what they have is a lot of the big medical technology companies are opening offices in Rochester, in downtown Rochester, for collaborative efforts with Mayo Clinic. So research companies and like software companies that do medical software, they're opening offices. So there's almost like a little tech scene, a medical tech scene in this little, if you live in the Chicago area, it's smaller than Naperville. But there's just this really strong economic engine, which makes it a very interesting little place to hang out in.
If Rochester is known as Med City, wouldn't a Club 33 there be Club Med?
Oh, Sky. Mm-hmm. Were you working on that for a while?
Yeah. I was workshopping that here on my notepad, and I thought that was clever.
Oh, well, it's a good
Good
thing
job.
that nothing else is going on this week. So we really don't have anything else to talk about. And now we can just say, enjoy the interview. Enjoy the interview. Everyone, enjoy. I'm not going to do news of the butt. I don't have any animal news. I'm still trying to remember how to podcast, because if you take 1 week off, you can remember. Take 2 weeks off, it's all out the window. I don't remember.
Well, you came back the right week, Phil. We need you. We need you to help us steer through current events.
Totally. Yeah. So, okay. Something happened on Saturday. Where were you when you heard that Trump had kind of been shot?
Kaitlyn. Me.
Kaitlyn.
I was literally, I had walked down the street from my house to a Persian ice cream store with some friends, and we had a whole lovely evening, and I didn't look at my phone and nothing was going on, and then walked back to my house and got out my phone and had a lot of messages about it. Yes,
Phil's
Bill.
hand
I'm
is
raising my hand.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
What is Persian ice cream?
It's ice cream
like-
you eat off a carpet.
It's like kind of stickier. It's like I don't know the right way to describe it. It's more like one thing.
What?
It's more like one.
It's like
Because how is ice cream multiple things?
it's a little gummier. Like it just is like more stuck together than
How
ice
many
cream.
things is our ice cream?
Like
It's more
frozen
stuff.
That was
custard?
not the relevant part. I was adding that to give a little color to the story. You could imagine yourself in my shoes.
I'm looking this up right now. I need to know.
Persian. Okay.
There's probably a term for it that I'm not using that I should use, but it's,
Let's spend as much time talking about Persian
Right.
ice cream as we just spent talking about Disney World and Rochester, Minnesota, and then we can just say we're done.
we're done. We don't have to talk about the content of why you asked the question.
Did you look it up, Sky? Persian ice
Yes,
cream?
it's called Bastani, which might be a relative of mine. I don't know. It's an Iranian ice cream made from milk, yolk, sugar, rosewater, saffron,
Yeah.
vanilla, and pistachios. It is widely called Persian ice cream.
Oh.
It often contains flakes of frozen clotted cream, which if you have too much of, you will end up at the Mayo Clinic. So yeah,
Or
it's-
Disney World.
Well, for anyone who lives in the Triangle area, go find yourself some Persian ice cream. It's good.
Okay. Interesting. And Sky, Saturday.
I was home. My wife and daughter were in Denver They're flying back from a soccer tournament, and so I was home. My son was, I don't know, golfing or something, and I came home from grocery shopping and put away the groceries, turned on the news, and was right there when it was like right as it happened. And I watched the live shot of him getting into the motorcade. And I saw the blood on his ear, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what happened? And then, of course, everything unfolded. I was just glued to the TV for a couple hours.
I was sitting at my mother's condo with two of my kids, my daughter-in-law, and my mother, and we were about to play a board game. And my daughter, youngest, who's been very glued to the news lately, said, "Did you hear there were shots fired at the Trump rally?" I said, "What? What?" He said, "Trump's okay, but he was hit in the ear." And we're like, "What are you talking? It was the craziest thing we'd ever heard. What are you talking about? That's crazy." And then we all had to, like, everyone pulled their phones out to verify, was this on Reddit? Did you get this from Reddit? But no, it was like, wow, that really happened. So what did you, Kaitlyn Chess, you really like politics. That's one thing we know about you. You really like politics. First of all, we're very glad that it wasn't worse than it was, but also extraordinarily sad about the loss of life that did occur there and the injuries. And it is truly a tragedy. But for the record, we're glad Donald Trump wasn't killed. Yeah. For those of you that might be doubters out there, no, seriously, this isn't how we do political discourse in America. It's just not how we do things. Conspiracy theories ran amok very quickly, extraordinarily quickly. That was one of the points I wanted to talk about. There was instant finger pointing, instant assigning of responsibility. People on the right said, Biden's rhetoric, that's why this happened. And people on the left said, Trump's bad behavior, that's why this happened. That's either Biden's fault or Trump's fault. J.D. Vance, one of the leading vice presidential candidates,
he was just announced as the vice presidential.
Was he?
Did that happen just now?
It just happened as we're recording this. Sorry,
I mean, this is not a bring everyone together in unity choice. Yeah. Wow. He just tweeted flat out, "This is Biden's fault. This is Biden's fault." Wow. Oh, see, now we've lost Kaitlyn.
I'm sorry.
She's on her phone.
She's researching this. Okay. So a couple of things. I'm curious, does this change Donald Trump? A near-death experience. And, some people said his tone afterwards is different. He's saying things, he's using the word unity. He says he threw out his speech that he's going to give at the Republican National Convention and give a whole new speech about unity. Not sure exactly what he means when he says unity. But is there a chance that he becomes a person who thinks more about what he says before he says it?
Well, given our faith, we have to say yes. Of course, there's a chance.
Okay,
right?
there's a chance.
We believe in the transformation of people. So here's the flip I made in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, and we kept seeing over and over and over again that famous scene of him being lifted up by the Secret Service and him pumping his fist and saying "fight, fight, fight"
it's our
with blood
new,
on his face.
Our new Iwo Jima photograph.
Yes. Absolutely. Like my initial reaction to that was, like Trump has not historically been a turn the other cheek kind of person. And so I thought
explicitly.
Yeah. And I thought this is primed to be used to inflate anger and vengeance and all kinds of terrible toxic things in his followers. And I was just like dreading the worst. What I've shifted to is I felt convicted after a little while of kind of marinating in that negativity. And I felt like I need to be praying for this man who's come within a fraction of an inch of death. And I've been praying that this is sort of a road to Damascus moment for Donald Trump, where he really considers his own mortality, the narrow escape of death. And he's said things already about, thanking God for saving him, and others have made those points. I don't know if this causes him to really reflect on his life, reflect on his values, reflect on his rhetoric, reflect on his power and what he can inspire people toward, good and bad. I really hope that this is a turning point where we do see a change in him, and he uses his platform and his power and his rhetoric to bring good and unity and forgiveness and healing and reconciliation and all those things that we'd want to see in our country, rather than anger and division and vitriol. I don't know. We're recording this on Monday afternoon. We will see as this convention unfolds. That's my hope. And it's not based on evidence. It's based on faith. And I really, really hope that's what happens.
Kaitlyn?
I agree with Sky. I also think watching people's reactions to this was greater evidence of something we already knew, which is that Trump plays a significant role in the tenor, the tone, the shape of our politics in the last few years, but he is not alone. Like, regardless of what he does to respond to this, we have colorful evidence in the last couple days of other people, not necessarily motivated directly by him, responding in really concerning, frightening ways. Like, my feeling in the past couple days since this has mostly just been grief over where we are and how polarized we are and how vitriolic our rhetoric has become. And I mean, to Sky's point, I'm not without hope that something like this can prompt change. I'm not without hope that apart from this, God can change things for us. But it has been really disheartening to see from all different corners of the political spectrum, people respond to this in really cruel ways, in ways that don't make anything better, only make things worse. I mean, there's just been so many instances of people saying things that only ratchet up the tension and the heat of this. And it really makes me wonder, if some of those people just don't see this, I felt like this was evidence that there are consequences to those things. We should all be doing what we can to ratchet the temperature down, even in our own communities. Like, this is a really intense, extreme example of things that can happen. But we've all seen in smaller ways the kind of heat of political rhetoric cause people to act in ways and do things and say things they wouldn't otherwise say. And we want to see the temperature lowered in our own communities. And it's been disheartening to see that there are financial incentives, that there are power incentives for people not to do that. And I just think it behooves all of us in whatever sphere of influence we have, even in really small ways, to say, right now, my goal is lower the temperature. My goal is keep people from being so on edge, because I really don't think that we are always cognizant of the ways that how intense this moment is can lead us to do or say things we wouldn't otherwise normally do. Not even someone who's at a high level of power. Like, I'm talking like snapping at people in your church, or, you know, just mistreating someone in your community. Like, it just feels like this is a scary time and people can be really on edge. And I'm really angry at the people who are making it worse by posting extreme rhetoric online that ratchets up the tension rather than bringing it down.
Were either of you on Twitter at all in the hours following the
I shouldn't
shooting?
have been, but I was.
Little bit.
Oh my
yeah.
gosh. I just like,
Yeah.
and it was not limited to one side at all,
No,
but the
it
stuff
wasn't.
that was being posted I was just like, my goodness, if you ever wanted a snapshot of the legitimacy of the doctrine of human depravity, this is it.
Yeah.
It was awful. Absolutely awful.
Yeah, there were voices on the left saying, I think this was staged. I think the whole thing was staged so Trump can win the election. And there were voices on the right saying, this was clearly authorized by Joe Biden. He clearly signed off on this 20-year-old, recently graduated from high school kid who crawled up a roof with his dad's rifle. He clearly signed off on that, or it never would have happened.
Yeah.
And that is, people just spin with those things, and they pick up a life of their own, and they go on and on and on and on. There has been, obviously a lot of criticism of, is our rhetoric too heated? And Biden has said we need to tone it down. Lots of people have said we need to tone it down. Jonah Goldberg made the comment that as much as you criticize Donald Trump for his own irresponsible rhetoric over the years, you also have to recognize that this was his quote, irresponsible rhetoric elicits irresponsible rhetoric in response.
Yes.
And that some of the things people say about Trump, it's like you feel, well, he's saying such exaggerated, horrible things. The only way to stop him is to give him a dose of his own medicine. We're going to say exaggerated, horrible things about him. And then we all go insane.
Okay. I think there's two different things going on here, though. One is the rhetoric, and that's legitimate. And I think Jonah is absolutely correct. Like, we have seen this dance between both sides politically in inflaming one another with very dehumanizing rhetoric about the other side. So you go back to 2015, 2016, and MAGA folks were accusing Democrats of being demonic pedophiles who literally drink the blood of children. And then you get Democrats calling MAGA people, fascists and comparing Trump to Hitler. He's going to put everybody in concentration camps. MAGA says Democrats hate America and want to destroy it. Trump says his political enemies are vermin, right? Kind of echoing Nazi rhetoric. And it just goes on and on and on. And that's a problem. And it definitely needs to be ratcheted down. And that dehumanizing language can make it seem justifiable to then enact violence against your political enemies. But there's this other category, which I think I haven't heard as much talk about it. I have a hypothesis to why. It's not rhetoric, it's actual behavior. And it's one thing to use this terrible language, and it's a problem. It's another thing when actual violence occurs and we don't denounce it. So January 6th was a violent attack on the United States Capitol. And maybe in the next 2 days before this podcast gets released, we hear something different. But Donald Trump has not denounced the violence that happened on January 6th. He called the people who did it great patriots. He says he's going to pardon them when he becomes president. Like, that reluctance to denounce political violence justifies political violence. And even when it was happening on January 6th, he didn't denounce it, and he didn't tell people to stop until hours and hours later. And we need to get to the point where the moment there's any degree of political violence, not just an assassination attempt, everyone needs to universally on all sides say this is not acceptable, period.
Right.
And that's problematic. So I think the rhetoric is a problem, but the behavior is a problem, and our silence when that behavior unfolds is a problem. And if it takes your own personal assassination attempt before you denounce political violence, that's a problem, but I hope we at least get there. And that he also says, no violence, I will not justify any of it, including when it's violence from his supporters.
Yeah. Kaitlyn?
I totally agree with Sky. I also think we need to be clear about the relationship between these two things, between behavior and the language, because I think some people might hear this conversation and think, well, some of the stuff that we've listed as kind of inflated rhetoric about coming from the left about Trump or coming from the left about the right is just true. It's just accurate. They want to do these really horrible, awful things. And it's hard to piece out like what is just fair descriptions. Trump has said some scary things. There are some scary things he wants to do. And then what is inflated. And some of the examples that Sky, you've already given, are like taking a tiny bit of a true thing and then making it really big. And it doesn't seem like a big deal to people because it's an election season and we're trying to motivate people to get out of their homes and vote. And there's evidence that things like this matter. I mean, the day after this assassination attempt, there were 3 homes on my street that suddenly had brand new Trump flags outside their houses. So like what happens and the way we talk about things does change people's political behavior. So I can understand some people going, there are real threats to a Trump presidency. And if we overinflate them a little bit, it's not a big deal because I'm just trying to get people to go out and vote. I'm not trying to get them to do a January 6th on the other side. I'm just trying to get them to go out and vote. And the problem with that is that it doesn't just stay in whatever predetermined box you have decided is acceptable. When we start exaggerating to existential levels, people won't stay in the bounds of whatever they have determined is acceptable political behavior because the stakes are no longer just normal politics. The stakes are existential. So you might say, the stakes are existential, but I'm not saying we should use political violence. But eventually, if you tell people enough that it is an existential threat, this is not just, it's really serious, which I think we can agree it is really serious. It's no longer just that. It's not people's lives really matter. The material conditions people live under really matter. It does affect people's lives and the quality of their lives, and even sometimes whether they live or die. Politics does affect those things. But no, this is our existence as a country, as a people. Your existence as a person is at stake. There's really no way to make that claim and then say, and political violence is off the table. No, of course it's on the table if it's an existential threat, which is where I think Christians across the political spectrum have missed the incredible gift that we have as people who believe in the coming redemption of all things and the resurrection of the body. Those beliefs should not motivate us to say, so politics doesn't really matter. It deeply matters. Vulnerable people's lives matter. But it keeps us from getting to this place where it's existential. Because even though great important things are at stake in every election, it's not an existential thing at stake. Like I still believe that even if there are great harmful effects here and now that really matter, there is a promise of redemption and resurrection that keeps me from saying, because the stakes are absolutely existential, I have to do whatever is necessary to stop them from happening. And so I think we've missed that gift as Christians, but I think many of us have also missed the real detrimental effects that can happen if we say, oh, I'm just motivating people to vote. It's like, you might start that way. It can end in places that you don't anticipate. And I'm worried that too many people who have seen very colorful examples of this stuff on the right have a mentality of it could never happen on the left. It just couldn't happen. Like we're the good guys, it couldn't happen. And I think we have to just believe that regardless of your political opinions, pushed to the edge, bad things can happen. And it doesn't mean we don't say the stakes are really high. The stakes are really high. But we stop ourselves before we get to the place of great exaggeration of existential threat, not just because I don't believe that's actually true, because I believe in the resurrection of the body and the redemption of all things, but because I'm worried if we bring it all the way up, if we ratchet it up that high, people won't continue to act in ways that we think are faithful or good or safe for everyone. They will start to act in ways that can cause even greater harm.
I think I put a thread up about this a couple days ago. Ever since the debate where Biden had that awful performance, it felt like the mainstream media on the left, that phrase existential threat has been just the drumbeat. And it felt to me like, okay, they've realized that their candidate is very, very weak and vulnerable. And so they need to ratchet up the fear in order to motivate people. And that phrase has been everywhere. You don't hear that phrase as much on the right for various reasons. But one thing you do hear on the right a lot, even before the debate, was Trump has said again and again and again, if Joe Biden wins in 2024, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. And it's
Same
often
thing.
linked to often linked to the border. And so, yeah, it is the same message. You're not going to have a country anymore. And to your point, Kaitlyn, whether it's the right or the left, you're not going to have a country, or it's an existential threat if Trump wins. The rational thing to do, if you genuinely believe that rhetoric, is to take any means necessary to stop your opponent. And again, we have no idea what the motivation was for this shooter, and we may never know. But that kind of hyperbolic rhetoric has no place, I think, for us as Christians because of the theological reason you gave. But it doesn't even have place for us if you're not a Christian, because I don't believe that the United States is going to cease to exist if one person or the other wins the election. I think there are real consequences, and there are things that worry me about one way or the other.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's an existential threat for the United States. I think it's actually more of an existential threat to Ukraine, who wins this election, than it is to the United States.
Ooh, that's a different podcast.
That's a different podcast.
We're not doing that one right now. A lot of people on the right immediately started tweeting things like, if you call someone Hitler again and again and again, don't be surprised when this happens. Which I think there's a point to that. We don't, because Hitler is the worst person any of us can imagine. To say this guy's Hitler, is a really incendiary thing to say. But having said that, a month ago, Eric Metaxas tweeted to all his followers, Biden is our Hitler. So,
there you go.
They're both Hitler. So they're both, we got to ratchet that down a little bit. And this isn't the first political violence or attempted political violence we've seen in the last few years. There was a potential assassin arrested outside Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh's house, who's currently on trial. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, there was an attempted don't know what at her house that ended up with her husband almost being killed with a hammer. Congressman Steve Scalise was shot at the Republican softball game. Congressman Gabby Gifford was shot in the head. A Democratic Congresswoman. Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan had a kidnapping plot that may have included her execution. So we have, it seems like, and maybe I'm wrong, in the last 10 years or so, a lot more people have gotten a lot more excited, and not necessarily in a good way of using that word, about politics. Have gotten more engaged, and have gotten more engaged because it's being presented more like, a horror movie, an action movie, it's again, existential threat. And I'm not sure exactly when it started. I don't know when it started, but it just keeps getting worse. And there's a kind of an arms race of outrage about, if you let the right do what they want, it's going to be Handmaid's Tale. It's going to be Handmaid's Tale. So let's all put on our handmaids costumes and walk around and mourn where we're headed. And if you let the left do what they want, it's drag queen story hour in every library, and your kids will be taken from you if you don't let them transition. So, we keep trying to paint the other team in the worst possible light by picking out the most outrageous things done by anyone on that team, and then holding that up as this is where they want to take us. This is where they want to take us. And I don't know how, once you've started in that direction and everyone is animated by that energy, how do you turn it down? Oh, Kaitlyn Chess. Yes, I see that hand.
I just was thinking when you started talking, like on one hand, yes, people have gotten more engaged politically in a very certain sense. Like their idea of what it means to be engaged politically is often, I consume a lot of political media.
Yes.
Or I said this last week, maybe it didn't even get included in the episode that came out to everyone, but I read all 900 pages of the Project 2025 document. Or someone told me at a church a few months ago, I read all the pages of the Biden deposition. And that's not actually doing politics. That's not you being engaged in politics. That's you consuming political media. And very often, actually, at least reading those documents is you just like reading something. I prefer that to I've been scrolling Twitter for hours, or I've watched a ton of YouTube videos, and people feel like they're doing something. And I do think people are doing this for a very good reason, which is that our political system is so broken that they feel a real lack of agency. They're looking at how messed up things are and they're like, I can't do anything. At least I can be informed. It feels like I'm doing something if I just read everything and scroll all the time and do all the things. And it's not actually doing politics. And not only is it not doing politics, but it very often is depriving us of the time, the energy, the emotional bandwidth that we would need to actually serve vulnerable people in our communities, to advocate for their practical needs, to build relationships with our neighbors. And that's what worries me, is not just that it's so that the heat is up, that the rhetoric is intense, that it feels really polarized. That worries me. But it worries me that people who have gotten really bought into all of that, especially on the internet, are not only doing something that isn't good for themselves, it's not good for their bodies or their nervous systems, but it's putting them in an emotional place and an energy place where they can't do work in the ways that they actually do have agency over. You're right that a lot of stuff happening at the national level, you have very little ability to control. But on some very local issues that affect vulnerable people in your community, you might have more ability to do something about it than you realize. And we're not able to do that well when we have been so caught up in national things that we have little ability to control, and much more than just national stuff, in media forms that do something to our brains and bodies, that put us on edge. We've talked about this on the show before, but when you are consuming media that is frightening, if there are threats that are being made, if there are scary scenarios being shown to you, your body reacts as if you are in physical danger. You are not in the mental, emotional, physical space to do something very practically good for your neighbors. And that's what worries me about this, is not just, I don't like that people are really angry or really scared. That's kind of understandable sometimes. It's that you're consuming things that make you angrier and more scared and put your body and brain in a mindset where you can do actually much less for vulnerable people in your communities and engage in politics in ways that would be really good.
There was a previous conversation we had, I don't know what episode it was, where I think it was you, Kaitlyn, who was comparing this to the difference between watching football, like an NFL game, and actually going out and playing a game of football in your neighborhood or with your community, or pick your sport. So many people think that watching an NFL game is the same as fully participating in the sport. And similarly, a lot of people think just watching politics on cable news or engaging it on social media feeds is the same as actually getting engaged in politics. And it sounds like you're saying, hey, spend less time watching the game on television and more time on the field in your community, caring about what's going on in your local area. That's actually being political. And we see it as a sport, and we pick a team and you root for your team and you despise the other team. But there are real stakes going on here. But you think just turning on the TV and engaging and yelling and being upset is you participating, and it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And people feel like there's not an alternative. So I understand why it feels like I'm doing something, but I wish that more often the voices that are ratcheting up the tension and the energy and the anger would say, but there are things you can do. Like, you're not actually without agency here. There is a brokenness to the system that deprives us of some agency, and we should do what we can to advocate for changes to that system structurally that give us more agency. But you do have some, even if it's like really small in local efforts, or even if it's, I was talking to some friends at church yesterday. It's incredible that we belong to a community that together has a lot of resources and has a lot of opportunities to seek flourishing in our community. And we can show up together and be a part of a committee. That sounds really boring. Or we can show up and teach little kids about the Bible. But it's like contributing in very small ways to the flourishing of this one little community. And that might feel trite and foolish in comparison to all of the great evil and dysfunction and scariness that's out there. But it actually does make you, I think, a healthier person. If you're like, I was able to look a kid in the face and tell them about what the kingdom of God looks like and how different it is from all of these wayward kingdoms we experience now. And that in some very small way, hopefully contributes by the grace of God to the health of this community I am a part of. And that's something. And that's something more than I tweeted something that really told someone else on the internet what's what.
Okay, so we criticize people on the show sometime. Here's what I want to try to remember. As I'm criticizing people, I want to try to remember that there are unstable people out there on both sides of the political spectrum, all over the political spectrum. There are more than 400 million guns out there. If an unstable person needs access to a gun, they will get access to a gun. There is no reason we can't frame our criticism in such a way to make it clear we don't actually mean go get them. We don't actually, that's not what I'm saying. So we can be more careful. We need to be very careful not to dehumanize people. And, examples on both sides. Trump recently said asylum seekers at the southern border were not human. That's a pretty clear dehumanization. He said they're animals. But at the same time, if you watch, late night talk shows and other liberal media, conservatives are the butt of every single joke. It's like they're so stupid that they're barely human. So in fact, I stopped. I love Stephen Colbert, but I finally stopped watching because there was just so much anger. Well, not anger, but belittlement.
Disdain.
Disdain aimed at conservatives. And I just, that is not good for my soul. So we don't want to ever add to that accidentally.
And I'll just add this, like, even if you consider someone or some group to be your enemy for whatever reason, Phil, your point is don't dehumanize them. But then secondly, the Christian commandment toward your enemy is to pray for them. It's not to shoot them. It's not to inflict violence upon them. It's not to diminish them in any way. It's to pray for them. And I guess there's different ways that's been interpreted over the years, but that ought to be our call to action and not any kind of violence or dehumanizing rhetoric. Before we go, Phil, can we talk about sort of the mythologizing and the spiritual dynamic of what happened on Saturday?
Sure. Trending on conservative Christian Twitter today is the phrase, God moved the bullet, which I project will be a country song within about 48 hours.
It almost seems beyond belief. Like this could not have been scripted better to validate all of the stuff in the Christian nationalist blogosphere or online world, all the online YouTube prophets. Like you could not have scripted something better.
Yeah.
Like even if there had been an assassination attempt and Trump got out unscathed, you'd be like, wow, that was amazing. But the fact that it hit him, he was injured, but escaped by the narrowest, it's unreal that so I understand the instinct to go, oh, God is behind this. But it just adds to the messianic aura that some people already had for Donald Trump. And now, that's an enormous amount of power that he has been granted because of this event. I think it's almost a foregone conclusion that he's going to win the election. And I wonder, what could he do with this level of power? There are people out there who genuinely believe he has been selected, ordained, and now saved by God. What could he do with that, for good or ill, in this moment? It's kind of frightening because he could propose all kinds of ridiculous things. And there's a segment of Americans who will be like, well, he's God's chosen. He's God's anointed. Just look at what happened at the
Sky.
He saved his life. It's a crazy amount of power.
Sky. I was trying to end on a positive note, Sky. I was really trying to, send him home happy.
Well, my point is he could use that platform that he's been granted to some people now to actually do genuine good.
Okay. Well, then we'll
I just hope
for
he
that.
does.
That's what we'll pray for. We're praying for that. Kaitlyn, are you praying for that?
Yes, but while Sky was talking, I was thinking just this last Sunday in Sunday school with the grown-ups, not with the kids, because it's a scary story. We talked about the story of the little king Joash who gets protected from his evil grandmother. It sounds like a fairy tale who's trying to kill him. But we were talking about how there's just this tendency to take these biblical stories of of people who were protected. We in church a few weeks ago, we were going through Isaiah. We talked about Cyrus. The pastor even said, people have a tendency to say, who's our Cyrus? Who's the person that God is using, that God is protecting, that God has chosen? And what we concluded on Sunday was in so many of these stories in the Bible, when you start to think, I have figured out who the hero of this story is, and it's a human, it takes a few verses or a chapter, and you discover, oh, actually, no, they end up doing something bad, or they aren't successful in what they set out to do. And the moral of the story is never this person is the hero, or this person is who you're supposed to emulate, and this person, they really saved the day, other than Jesus Christ, who really is the main character of the story. And so to the people who are saying, oh, this is proof that God is, we don't know. It's not even clear sometimes in scripture. Sometimes these are confusing stories where we're I'm not even sure what I'm supposed to take out of this, other than God is in control. God protects and provides for God's people, even in ways that seem really strange at the time, yes, but not in ways usually that are clear to us, or that we can say, right there, that's it, that's the answer. And if we're starting to do that with a lot of confidence about a political leader, then I think we're doing it wrong. We're misunderstanding who the main character of this story is.
On one level, I totally agree with you, Kaitlyn. Amen. But you are going against the current of human psychology and history. We do this all the time. But even the Moses story, the whole story of Moses being protected as an infant in the Nile. It's all the providence of God, that this is going to be Israel's deliverer and all that. George Washington famously survived a massacre during the French and Indian War. It came to mythologize him as, America's Abrahamic founder, chosen by God. We do this all the time with our heroes. Even the fact that Abraham Lincoln, who obviously did not survive his headshot, was assassinated on Good Friday, and people used that to go, oh, it's, he dies for the Union, and on and on. So we do this to our heroes all the time. But that picture of Donald Trump with his defiant fist and a bloody cheek, with the flag behind him, it is an Iwo Jima kind of moment. And he is now an American icon who 20, 30 years from now, there will be t-shirts with Trump's picture on it, like Che Guevara. He is going to be this immortalized icon of the American right. And nothing's going to change that. No matter what he does, good or bad, going forward, that is solidified in American mythology forever.
Unless he actually does what he plans to do and puts tariffs on all imports and a 60% tariff on everything made in China, and the price of our goods actually goes up as a result. Then he's lost us. Then he's lost us. Okay, I got to wrap this up.
I think Sky. He's immortalized. He's immortalized.
Sky, you have to stop talking now. Okay,
I'm done.
You have to stop talking. Kaitlyn, you have to stop telling us how much you disagree with Sky, but agree with me, because I need to wrap this up. So, hey, everybody, what do? Oh, guess what? Donald Trump is made in the image of God. And even if you consider him an enemy or an opponent, pray for him. Joe Biden, made in the image of God. Even if you consider him an enemy or opponent or a bad influence on the direction of the country, pray for him. And the families of those that got caught in the crossfire, literally caught in the crossfire of our septic politics, pray for them. Pray for them. Okay, that's what we can do. All right, thanks for being here. Podcast interview coming up. We'll see you next week. Bye. The Holy Post is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. I'm not super good at people stuff. I like ideas and technology and puppets. When Lisa and I got married, it was a shock to see just how different we approach the world and each other. The thoughtful gift of marriage counseling from one of our parents was a huge help in those early years. Faithful Counseling can help you get through life's rough spots. With more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, Faithful Counseling makes it easy to find a great therapist that'll work for you. You can meet over video or phone sessions, and changing therapists is easy and free until you find the right fit. So don't struggle alone. Let Faithful Counseling match you with a licensed therapist who can help you grow into the best version of yourself. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional, faith-based counseling you need. And there's a special offer for our listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode.
There's no doubt that the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, is one of the most important texts in the Bible. And yet it's also one of the most neglected by Christians. In fact, some have even constructed elaborate theological arguments for why we don't need to obey Jesus' commands in the sermon. My guest today is Rich Villodas. He's the lead pastor of New Life Fellowship, a multi-ethnic, multi-generational urban church family in Queens, New York. His new book is called The Narrow Path: How the Subversive Way of Jesus Satisfies Our Souls. The book is a fantastic exploration of the Sermon on the Mount. Before we jump into that conversation, I have just two quick notes. First, Rich and I spoke before the assassination attempt on Donald Trump this past weekend, which is why we don't mention it. But a lot of what he says about the Sermon on the Mount seems incredibly relevant to this moment. And second, I did an extended bonus interview with Rich for HOLYPOST Plus subscribers about Jesus' command to not judge others. And honestly, it's an amazing section of the book, and that bonus interview alone is worth the price of becoming a HOLYPOST Plus subscriber. So to access that bonus interview and to learn more about HOLYPOST Plus, go to holypost.com. All right, here is my conversation with Rich Villodas. Rich, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Sky, always a joy to be with you.
Yeah, I love talking to you. Congratulations on the new book. It's called The Narrow Path: How the Subversive Way of Jesus Satisfies Our Souls. Got my advanced copy here, which I have been through. Enjoy it. So it's about the Sermon on the Mount, which hopefully is not a new topic for many of our listeners. But here's where I want to begin. When I was a pastor, I did a class many, many years ago in my church about the Sermon on the Mount. And I've shared this in other places, but the first day of class, we read through, this is an adult class, we read through Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And then I asked these mostly lifelong church-going, primarily evangelical Christians, do you think Jesus was serious? Do you believe he actually expected his followers to live the way he's described in the Sermon on the Mount? And I was surprised that not a single hand went up. Not a single person. And then we had a discussion for the rest of the hour about why they thought Jesus was not serious about this. And so I want to turn it over to you. Being a pastor, engaging with the Sermon on the Mount and everything, what has been your experience when you introduce these themes and topics when people engage the sermon? Do you get that kind of, well, yeah, but it's good, but Jesus didn't really expect us to do this. And how do you respond to that point of view?
Yes, Scott, I hear it usually on two fronts, one from a personal level and one from a social perspective. So from a personal level, it's, these are ideals that are ultimately to just point us to the grace of God. So Jesus really didn't mean for us to live this stuff. The Sermon on the Mount was given to show our inability to live it out and to trust God, as opposed to trusting God and living it out. So that's the first end. The second is related to just the world we live in, and how does the Sermon on the Mount apply to larger socioeconomic, geopolitical realities. And so the resistance is, if we did what Jesus is telling us to do here, we will not be a nation, we will not be a country. How would I defend my family? So it gets people go on the defensive very quickly. Personally, and then when we think about the larger social political world we live in, and my response initially is, especially first of all to the individual, again, the Sermon on the Mount was not given to show simply our inability to live it out and to trust God. I think there's something in there. I think but for me, order is important. I think we are given it to trust God, to align our hearts to God and to Jesus, and to trust Him to empower us to actually live it out. So the accent, I believe, from Jesus is in the living it out. And we're going to do it imperfectly. We're going to stumble our way forward. But I think He was serious about this stuff.
The part that I always get snagged on, and I've heard that argument many, many times in different settings, people say, well, it's just an ideal thing, and Jesus said it because he knows we can't live it out, and it makes us rely on God's grace on it. The part I always snag on is speaking of order, he ends the whole sermon with a story about the importance of actually doing what he just said, which is the story of the wise and the foolish builder. And you know, a lot of kids in Sunday school are taught that that's a parable about a Christian and a non-Christian, but that's not what the wise builder is not the one who says they follow Jesus.
Yeah, he actually literally says, like, whoever hears these words and puts them into practice,
right,
is like someone who builds their life on a strong foundation, and the person who listens but does not put them into practice. So I think Jesus kind of spells it out pretty clearly for us.
Yeah. Have you encountered this just recently? Came across my radar again, but sometimes people holding to a dispensational theological framework have argued that Christians don't need to take any of Jesus' words seriously because he's speaking to Jews. And we only need to take the apostles' words in the epistles seriously because that's for Gentiles or Christians. Have you encountered that argument that dismisses the Sermon on the Mount?
Not in my context too much. I mean, I'm very familiar with the dispensationalists. I mean, when I became a Christian, the first Bible that someone gave me was a Schofield Study Reference Bible, and it was so they said, read this and you'll be okay. So I'm very familiar with the dispensational theology behind it. That's not for me, it's more on a pragmatic resistance, more so than a theological one. This stuff is not realistic. Turning the other cheek, really. I don't think that's loving your enemies in the world we're in. It's more pragmatic. That's where the resistance is found.
Yeah. Talk about the corporate dimensions of this. You mentioned it earlier, but I'm thinking of Russell Morris told the anecdote that he was speaking somewhere and he's talking about loving your enemy in a political context, loving your enemies and turning the other cheek. And he was confronted by a church member saying, like, who gave you those liberal talking points? And he's like, well, they're from Jesus. They're from the Sermon on the Mount. And their response was, well, that may have worked back then, but that doesn't apply today because we're in this, threatening environment where, Joe Biden's going to round us all up and put us in concentration camps or something. But how do you respond to that corporate notion? Like, you can't apply these things in a collective sense.
Yeah. For me, I think what happens is instead of wrestling first and foremost with the principle Jesus is laying out, with the ethic that Jesus is proposing, with the language about what life in the kingdom of God is like, instead of beginning there and then wrestling outward with, okay, now what could this mean? Now the application of it might look different from context to context, and we might have to discern appropriately what this looks like individually, interpersonally, institutionally, politically, across the board. My concern is that folks just jump right to the inability to do it, and I think that is the biggest point of concern that I have around the Sermon on the Mount. To talk about turning the other cheek in a context of war, again, first of all, lots of folks don't even know what Jesus means when they talk about that. But that being put aside, I think lots of folks go right into application and spend no time. So if someone comes into my house in the middle of the night, you expect them to kill me and my family and not turn the other cheek. I mean, that's where it goes to the most extreme examples, as opposed to what might this look like for us on a day-to-day basis, and then do the hard work of discerning what might be the invitations to follow Jesus in this way and in this context.
So Dallas Willard talked about how Jesus is the smartest person who's ever lived. And if we believe that, then we really need to take what he says in the Sermon on the Mount seriously and reflect on it, do that kind of processing you're mentioning of wrestle with it, not just jump to the most extreme example to dismiss it. But it feels like an awful lot of even Christians in our society kind of think Jesus was stupid and that he didn't really contemplate these difficult moral quandaries, and therefore they just dismiss him out of hand as this is irrelevant, this doesn't work right now. And that's kind of an indictment of the way many of us have been taught to think about Jesus if we don't think his most central ethical teachings are relevant to contemporary life.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons I put the word subversive in the subtitle of the book was because I realize how undermining Jesus's wisdom to the prevailing notions of what wisdom is in our world. And so it reminds me also of Paul's kind of language of, God has taken the foolish things of the world to confound the wise and the weak things to confound the strong. And so I think my larger frame of the book, I think, names some of this here, where I think in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, this is me in three big categories, trying to frame the Sermon on the Mount through resisting moralism, successism, and individualism. And by moralism, I'm referring to, in my context here, a way of fixating on the externals to the degree where there's no interior examination whatsoever. And so Jesus continuously in the Sermon on the Mount says, you've heard it said, but I say unto you. And he's trying to take people deep beneath the surface. That's number one. The successism is a phrase that I got from Dale Bruner, New Testament theologian. And the successism is, what's the good life look like? And I think Jesus is undermining prevailing notions of what the good life looks like, which is why he begins with the Beatitudes as to what's really a happy life in the kingdom of God. And so I think people looking at Jesus and saying, he doesn't make any sense, he might not be the smartest person in the world, actually makes sense from a very worldly perspective.
Right.
That it doesn't, this is not efficient. This is not going to get the job done from a worldly perspective whatsoever. And so from a worldly point of view, it makes a lot of sense to dismiss Jesus as being the smartest or the wisest person alive.
Right. Well, I think what you're capturing there is the central dilemma of the contemporary church.
Yes.
Which is when you have people, or you're trying to attract people who are carrying a worldly set of values and goals and desires.
Yes.
They want health, they want wealth, they want success, they want privilege, they want all the trappings that the world tells us we should want. When we're trying to attract those people into the church or into faith, the temptation is to say, oh, Jesus is how you can get all of those things.
Yes.
And then they encounter a text like Matthew 5-7 and they go, this is ridiculous. This is not how I'm going to defeat my enemies. This is not how I'm going to get rich. This is not how I'm going to get successful and famous.
Yes.
And so they dismiss it rather than telling people, well, actually, those values and desires and goals that you've inherited from the culture, they're actually antithetical to the way of Jesus, and they're antithetical to his kingdom. And we need to see those desires transformed in order for Jesus to begin to make sense to you. But that's much harder to do. And so a lot of us just don't want to do that work.
We don't want to do it, which is why, speaking of someone else who's written on the Sermon on the Mount, I think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the cost of discipleship. And Bonhoeffer's language is, when Christ calls a person, he bids that person to come and die. That's really the essence of the Sermon on the Mount. That does not get people very excited. And quite frankly, it doesn't get me excited, Sky. I mean, I'm like, I don't want to die to all the things that I think are going to bring me joy in life. In fact, on a regular, as I was writing the book, I found myself deeply confronted by Jesus and his teachings. For example, on money. Jesus presents money not as this neutral tool, but as a rival God. And it's very easy to go to that text in Timothy that says it's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And I think that's true. It's in the Bible. And Jesus seems to be giving a whole nother perspective that money has a life of its own. It's like a rival God. And I must be on guard against it on a regular basis. Reading that and wrestling with it and writing on it just exposed all the ways that I find myself caught in its orbit. But yeah, Bonhoeffer said it right. To follow Christ is an invitation to come and die. And that is not an appealing message to the larger American evangelical culture.
Okay, that brings me to something that you wrote right at the introduction of the book. In the first couple pages, you say, the sermon is not how we achieve salvation, it's how we demonstrate it.
Yeah.
I agree. Amen. You're right up front. I appreciate the fact that you're dismissing this idea that if you just do all these things in the sermon, you've achieved some right standing with God. You put that aside. But your point that this is how we demonstrate it raises another question, which is, we've been talking about how unpopular a view it is in the contemporary American church to take this sermon seriously and to employ it and to seek to follow it. If that's the case, and you're arguing this sermon is how we demonstrate our salvation in Christ,
yes,
what does it mean that so few people in the American church are actually living out or seeking to live out these commands? Is that an indictment of a lack of salvation in much of the church?
I would say 100% absolutely yes. In fact, it's very. I begin the book with how Jesus, in many respects, ends it with this narrow path and this broad path, and lots of folks have sought to interpret that scripture as heaven and hell. Enter the narrow path because essentially that's heaven, and the broad path is hell. And most people are going to hell. Don't go to hell. Go on the narrow path. Go in heaven. And I think when Jesus is talking about that, I think of course there are eternal implications of that, which the Sermon on the Mount talks about on a regular occasion. Jesus talks about, but I think Jesus was emphasizing the reality of following him right here, right now. That to follow the narrow path is not simply going to heaven. It's following what is often regarded as the restricted or restrictive way of following Jesus, which is to say that there are a lot of Christians in this world that are not on the narrow path. Now, what does that say for their eternal destination? Only God can figure that out. But I would
Jesus
say,
does say the broad is the path that leads to destruction. So that's some indication.
And I do think that destruction is not just for the life to come. I think it's in the life right now. Right. And so what does it say about current state of Christianity when those who are say, I follow Jesus, but don't take his word seriously in the Sermon on the Mount? We might be on the broad road, which is why I think there's some surprise in the Gospels. Matthew 7, some will say, Lord, Lord, I've done all these things in your name. I've prophesied, I've casted out demons. And Jesus says, I never knew you. And I wonder if the no is not simply just this personal relationship with Jesus, but also a knowing of you decided to follow me on this path as well. Because it's very easy to cast demons out and prophesy, but not live this subversive countercultural ethic of Jesus. And I think that's the scandal of the Sermon on the Mount as well.
Yeah, and going back to the parable at the end of the wise and foolish builder, that's exactly what he's talking about.
Yes.
The foolish builder, the houses look the same.
Yeah.
Right? This is somebody who's claiming to identify with Jesus, but he hasn't actually obeyed his words, and therefore the house is built on sand. And at the end, it falls.
Yes.
And it's destroyed. You mentioned the broad path earlier, and a couple of the components of that broad path, one being moralism, this fixation on external obedience rather than a deeper internal kind of righteousness. And you talked about successism. But there was a third thing you mentioned in the book that you used to define this broad path, and it's individualism.
Yeah.
A lot of our tradition has emphasized, my personal relationship with Jesus, my personal relationship with God, my personal salvation. And you really dismantle that because Jesus does in the sermon. Explain why individualism is part of your definition of this broad path.
I think in some ways, Guy, when I'm writing this, I'm thinking this is so on the nose. This is so obvious. I mean, are folks just going to skip through these pages? And then I realized, no, Jesus spent some time highlighting what genuine faith looks like. And consistently, I don't think Jesus lets us off the hook in saying that our love for our neighbor is proof of our love for God. Full stop, period. And all throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about the ways that we relate to one another, whether we're talking about anger, whether we're talking about sexual desire, whether we're talking about our enemies, whether we're talking about the ways we use our words, whether we talk about the ways we pray. Jesus is consistently removing any notion that we could have a relationship with God that has nothing to do with our relationship with neighbor. And I think this has implications for every aspect of our lives, whether we're talking about in our homes with our families and our children and our neighbors, whether we're talking about in larger geopolitical realities. I think this has everything to do with following Jesus. And he refuses constantly to let us get off the hook to say, if I just have a relationship with God, if I just pray right, if I just read the Bible, if I just go to church, if I'm a good person, that's all I need. And Jesus is saying repeatedly in the Sermon on the Mount, our love for our neighbor is ultimately proof of our love for God. And that's why I inserted individualism into that as well.
Yeah, I'm really grateful you did. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I really got my nose into the Sermon on the Mount for the first time, maybe as a college student, I think it was from reading Bonhoeffer and The Cost of Discipleship. But what really struck me is not only does Jesus always link our relationship with God to our relationship with those around us, our neighbor, he actually puts the neighbor relationship first.
Yes.
He prioritizes that. So Matthew 5, if you're giving your gift at the altar, an act of worship to God,
Yes.
and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift at the altar, go first be reconciled to your brother, and then come and worship. So he puts the reconciliation between people ahead of your worship of God.
Yes.
And then in Matthew 6, it's, if you do not forgive those who've sinned against you, your heavenly Father will not forgive you. Again, the horizontal comes before the vertical. And in chapter 7, the measure with which you judge others, God will use to judge you. Again, the horizontal comes before the vertical. And like, I remember as a teenager reading that and going, this is the antithesis of what I was taught in American Christianity, which was you need to get yourself right with God first and then fix everything else.
Yeah.
And Jesus said, no. Get these horizontal things cleaned up, because that's then a reflection of your standing with me.
And the extent to which Jesus gives examples of that is really sobering and terrifying in some ways. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, Matthew 5, if you are about to offer your gift at the altar and remember someone has something against you, I mean, think about that for a moment. People are traveling perhaps long distances to get to a place of worship. They have to buy whatever animal they're going to sacrifice. They have to wait in line like everyone else. I mean, we're talking perhaps many, many hours or many, many days of getting to the point where you're about to make an offering. And so you have journeyed, you spent money, you've been through crowds. This is just a bad day in New York City, basically. But you get to the place of offering and then remember, oh no, there is some relationship that's not right. Let me put this animal down. Let me go through this traffic again. Let me walk back home, whatever it might be. Jesus is offering some extreme examples of what it means to be right with God, that the extent to which we are committed to making things right with our neighbor is the extent to which our life is right with God. And that is so un-Christian from the ways that we understand Christianity today. And so I think over and over again, Jesus is giving some, I think, powerful, poignant, very disruptive language for us to, be reminded that our relationship with God is, as you said, Sky, a reflection in many ways of our relationship with our neighbor. And if that's the case, no wonder people don't like the Sermon on the Mount and just want to say, no, this is just to prove that I'm in need of the grace of God.
Okay, I want to talk about prayer for a minute, because you have this interlude, roughly the middle of your book, about prayer, because you say that tucked into the middle of the Sermon on the Mount is this message about prayer. We find the Lord's Prayer in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. And you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you think order is pretty important. And the fact that this prayer is at the center of the Sermon on the Mount is not an accident.
Yeah.
You even go so far as to say that prayer is the secret to walking the narrow path with Jesus. What do you mean by that?
I do think, the order is important. I love what Dale Bruner said first at the beginning. He says, before Jesus commands, he blesses. And so he begins with blessing the Beatitudes. Then he begins his commands. If you're going to follow me in this place. And I do think when we read it, it's very easy to go, wow, who can do any of this? Much like his disciples would say in other occasions. And I think that's when Jesus brings us to prayer. Now, what's interesting is, the disciples only asked Jesus to teach them one thing, and that's prayer. And I think
Luke 11.
As they look at his life, I think they come to the conclusion that he's able to do what he's able to do, live how he's able to live, because he has some kind of secret life with God. And I think in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, that's probably the ache, the desire, the longing of the disciple. How do I actually live into this to which Jesus then teaches them, what it means to pray. And then I love how he does it because, and I didn't spend too much time in it because I'm hoping to write something in the future on this, but Jesus has the disciples, be mindful that you don't pray super religiously or superstitiously. And on 2 of those occasions, he's saying, don't pray like the pagans do, and don't pray, for show. But when you pray in this way. And then he teaches the Lord's Prayer, which has become, I think is the most important prayer in the entire Bible. But I think what Jesus is doing there is essentially saying, to live in the way I'm calling you to live is not just mustering it up. It's not just willpower. It's living from a deeper center of communion and union with me. And that's where I think the correction takes place again. Yes, Jesus is calling us to live this thing here, but not in our own strength. I think we need a life of abiding and communing with Jesus in order to get the resources so that, back to Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard said, his definition of grace in one place was what God does, in you that you can't do for yourself, or what God does for you, what you can't do for yourself. And I think that's what we need in this context as well. We need the grace of God doing for us what we can't do for ourselves.
Everything you just said there, I'm sure there's someone listening to this who's going, I've never heard prayer described that way before. Because the popular understanding of prayer is it's communication.
Right.
It's me talking to God, and usually that involves me asking God for things that I need. And that's certainly true. I mean, Jesus talks about asking our Heavenly Father for that which we need. But the words you use there to describe the Sermon on the Mount, prayer in the Sermon on the Mount, you talked about abiding in him. You talked about grace. You talked about communion with him. That's a different vision of prayer than just, hey, recite these words and ask for these things. How does someone move from a communication, narrow view of prayer to the kind of communion vision of prayer that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's, a few things are needed in order to do that. First of all, I do think it requires us to normalize some boredom in our own prayer journey. Prayer is, lots of folks, and I have been in this case in the last 26 years of following Jesus, would rate my prayer or that prayer session on the scale of, did I feel anything? Did I hear anything? Am I different coming out of it than I am stepping into it? And I trust that God meets us in those places. But if we're only after what we can get out of prayer, I think we miss out on the deeper subterranean work that God wants to do. I remember Brennan Manning, he one of his books, I don't think it was the Ragamuffin Gospel. There was another one where he said something to the effect of, do I worship God or do I worship my experience of God? And that's such a provocative question because I have been guilty of worshiping my experience of God. And how do I know I worship my experience of God? When positive experiences are no longer there, I don't show up. And so I think abiding in God requires us to normalize the reality of boredom. I think it requires us to reframe the distractions and distractedness that we feel in our lives. But abiding is, one way that I think about this, I've been really shaped by the contemplative monastic tradition. And so silence for me is a way of abiding with God. The slow reading of scripture is a way of abiding with God. Offering very simple phrases in 5, 10, 15 minutes of prayer. My go-to phrase is, Jesus, here I am. And when my mind gets distracted about anything and everything, very gently saying, Jesus, here I am. I want to do your will. And so I think for some folks who see prayer as communication, just talking, I think there is some of that. And of course, Jesus even tells us in the Lord's Prayer for daily bread, teach us, give us this day our daily bread. But he begins with our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. I think there's just sacredness, a holiness, a willingness to recognize relationship before what I can get out of this here. So, but those are a few ways that I personally have tried to live into kind of the abiding, communing way of God.
If I recall, you come from a more Pentecostal, charismatic
Christian in that context. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So for you to talk about the virtue of boredom, that's borderline heretical.
Most certainly is. And one of the things I'm grateful for, I became a Christian, 15 family members became a Christian in one night in a Spanish Pentecostal service in Brooklyn. And all I knew was the loud expressions of prayer and communion. But thankfully, 2 years after becoming a Christian, a professor gave me Henry Nouwen's Return of the Prodigal Son. And that set me on a whole journey of reading every book he put out. Thankfully, they were only like 70 and 80 pages long, and which then introduced me to the desert tradition, which introduced me to, the Thomas Mertons of the world, and going to monasteries. So in my first 3 years of following Jesus, I was able to hold together, through good mentorship as well, the loud, expressive times of prayer, as well as the very still and quiet and silent times of prayer as well.
I honestly, Rich, I think this is why I resonate with you so much, is we've clearly been influenced by a lot of the same voices and perspectives in our formation. And I think it's wonderful that you're able to talk about the contemplative tradition and the quietness and the stillness and the boredom and all of that. And you're not dismissing the value of the loud and the exciting and sometimes even spectacular that is often lifted up in the tradition you're from. So it isn't an either or here. But how do people, in your context, when you teach, when you bring them to the narrow path, to the Sermon on the Mount, to the Lord's Prayer, and you start talking to them about that deeper, subterranean, less visible life with God, how is that received in contexts where so much can be externalized and spectacular?
Yeah, in my context, I'm getting pushback all over the place because of the level of our diversity. The church I pastor, New Life Fellowship in Queens, has folks from over 80 nations represented in a neighborhood where 123 languages are spoken. And we have every aspect of diversity you can imagine. Generational diversity, socioeconomic diversity, political diversity, theological diversity. And so some folks hear the silence and they get triggered by it, because maybe they came out of a more Catholic tradition and they're like, wow, this reminds me too much of the Catholic tradition. Or the Pentecostals and Charismatics are like, we should be calling on the name of God right now, not being still. And then there are lots of folks who, it's an oasis. Like, my life has been filled with so much noise. I need this in my life. What I've discovered is, in a diverse context like that, I think the integration of all these things are really important. And so there is a time for loud, expressive cries and prayers and yearnings to God. In fact, in the Pentecostal context I came from, I used to see, I look back and I see, wow, in a very poor context in Brooklyn where I grew up, where people did not have either a theology or either money for like therapy or someone to talk about their deepest, darkest secrets or pains. Those Pentecostal contexts where people were falling on the floor and offering expressive cries, for me, often felt not just spiritual but psychological. Like there was like my soul was yearning for catharsis. I remember seeing one woman who just was in agony, and then a moment in the service came and there was an expressive, she fell on the floor and then she sat back in her chair, like in her right mind again. And I was thinking, wow, there is something profoundly spiritual and profoundly psychological around this. And so that's why I like to make room for it, especially in different contexts. But I think when there's integration and, hey, there's time to say something, good old Ecclesiastes 3, and there's time to be silent. I think it's receptive, it's received in our community. However, there are going to be people all across the board who, for whatever reason, going to have a hard time.
Well, I mean, it just speaks to the importance of us being in dialogue with people from traditions and,
absolutely right,
theological frameworks that may be a little bit foreign to us. We're going to wrap it up, but would you be willing to stick around for like 10, 15 minutes? Because I want to maybe do a little bonus conversation with you, talking about, you have a whole chapter on judgment where Jesus, of course, says in the Sermon on the Mount, do not judge. I want to talk about that. And so if you're a HOLYPOST Plus subscriber, you can go over there and get that bonus conversation. But Rich, grateful for the book. We can't get too much of the Sermon on the Mount. So to have your point of view and wrestling with it, and you're very transparent in it, which is incredibly helpful for all of us. So I recommend people pick up The Narrow Path, How the Subversive Way of Jesus Satisfies Our Souls. Excellent book. Just came out in July, so I hope people will pick it up, and look forward to having you back on the show again soon.
Always a joy to talk to you, Sky.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.